My brother took my inheritance while pretending to help me after my divorce. He laughed in court. But my final statement left the judge stunned. I'm 36 years old, and 8 months ago, I learned that the brother I trusted to help me through the worst period of my life had actually been systematically stealing my inheritance while pretending to be my protector. My younger brother Caleb is 33, and he managed to convince me to sign over power of attorney during my messy divorce, claiming he was protecting my assets from my ex-wife's lawyers. What he was really doing was transferring everything our late father had left me into his own accounts while I was too emotionally destroyed to notice. Let me start with some context about how I ended up in such a vulnerable position. 2 years ago, my marriage to Jennifer fell apart in spectacular fashion. We'd been married for 8 years, and I thought we had a solid relationship until I discovered she'd been having an affair with her personal trainer for over a year. The betrayal was devastating, but what made it worse was how vindictive Jennifer became during the divorce proceedings. Jennifer hired an aggressive attorney who went after every asset we'd accumulated during our marriage, including trying to claim a portion of the inheritance I'd received from my father 3 years earlier. Dad had passed away from lung cancer at age 71, leaving me his house, his small business, and about $180,000 in savings and investments. The inheritance had been kept in separate accounts, but Jennifer's lawyer was arguing that since some of it had been used for home improvements and family expenses, it should be considered marital property. I work as an electrician and had been running Dad's small electrical contracting business since his death. The divorce was consuming all my mental energy, and dealing with lawyers, asset valuations, and financial documentation felt overwhelming. I was sleeping maybe 3 hours a night, barely eating, and struggling to keep the business running while fighting to protect what my father had worked his entire life to build. That's when Caleb stepped in as my supposed savior. He worked in finance at a regional bank and presented himself as someone who understood these complicated financial matters better than I did. He said Jennifer's lawyers were using predatory tactics and that I needed to be more strategic about protecting my assets before they could be frozen or claimed in the divorce settlement. "You're too emotional to handle this properly," Caleb told me during one of our late-night phone calls. "Let me help you organize everything so Jennifer can't touch what Dad left you. I know how these divorce attorneys operate, and they'll find ways to tie up your money for years if we don't act fast." Caleb's solution was for me to sign a temporary power of attorney that would allow him to manage my financial affairs during the divorce proceedings. He explained that having assets in his name temporarily would protect them from being frozen or seized, and that once the divorce was finalized, everything would be transferred back to me. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperate to protect my father's legacy from being destroyed by divorce lawyers. Caleb had always been the smarter one when it came to money and business, and he'd never given me any reason not to trust him. We'd grown up close, despite the 3-year age gap, and he'd been supportive throughout Dad's illness and death. The power of attorney document Caleb prepared looked official and professional. He explained each section to me, emphasizing how it was designed to be temporary and specific to protecting my inheritance during the divorce. The language was complex, but Caleb assured me it was just standard legal terminology to ensure the protection held up in court if challenged. I signed the papers on a Friday evening in November, sitting at Caleb's kitchen table while his wife Lauren made us coffee and expressed sympathy for what I was going through. They both seemed genuinely concerned about helping me navigate this difficult period, and I felt grateful to have family support during such a dark time. Within days of signing the power of attorney, Caleb had transferred my father's house into his name, moved the investment accounts to his control, and taken over management of the business assets. He explained each transfer as a necessary protective measure, providing me with documentation that showed everything was being held in trust for my benefit. For several months, this arrangement seemed to be working exactly as Caleb had promised. Jennifer's lawyers couldn't touch the inherited assets because they were no longer technically in my name, and my divorce attorney praised my brother's foresight in protecting the inheritance from being claimed as marital property. Caleb would send me monthly reports showing the status of all the transferred assets, complete with account statements and investment performance updates. He even continued paying me a salary from the business and handling all the administrative duties that had been overwhelming me during the divorce proceedings. The divorce was finalized in March, with Jennifer receiving her share of our marital assets but unable to claim any portion of my father's inheritance. I felt like I'd survived the worst experience of my life with my financial future intact, thanks to my brother's help and expertise. But when I asked Caleb to begin transferring everything back to my name, his response changed everything. Actually, he said during what I thought would be a celebratory dinner, "I've been thinking that this arrangement is working pretty well for both of us. You don't have to worry about managing investments or business operations, and I can make sure everything continues to grow properly." I assumed he was just being cautious about the timing of the transfers and would eventually follow through on our agreement. I had no idea that Caleb had been systematically converting my inheritance into his permanent assets while maintaining the facade of temporary protection. It would take me months to discover the truth, and by then, Caleb had stolen everything my father had worked his entire life to build. But what he didn't know was that I'd been keeping detailed records of every conversation and every promise he'd made about returning my inheritance. When we finally faced each other in court, Caleb thought he'd won. He had no idea what I was about to reveal. The first red flag came in April, about a month after my divorce was finalized. I asked Caleb about starting the process of transferring everything back to my name, and he gave me a vague response about waiting for the optimal tax timing and making sure there wouldn't be any lingering legal issues from the divorce. These things take time to do properly, he said. We want to make sure Jennifer can't come back later and claim there was fraud or hidden assets. Give it a few more months, and then we'll start moving everything back. It seemed reasonable at the time. I was still emotionally drained from the divorce and honestly relieved not to have to deal with financial paperwork and investment decisions. Caleb continued sending me monthly reports and paying me a salary from Dad's business, so I assumed everything was proceeding according to our plan. But as spring turned into summer, Caleb's explanations for delaying the transfers became increasingly elaborate. He started talking about market conditions, tax implications, and legal technicalities that required waiting for better timing. When I pressed him for specific timelines, he'd change the subject or provide complex financial justifications that made my head spin. The second red flag was more subtle. In June, I noticed that Caleb and Lauren had made some significant lifestyle upgrades. They'd bought a new luxury SUV, taken an expensive vacation to Europe, and started talking about renovating their kitchen. When I asked Caleb about their sudden prosperity, he mentioned some successful investments and a bonus from his bank job. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, the timing was suspicious. Caleb's newfound wealth seemed to coincide with his management of my inheritance, but he'd always been good with money, so I attributed their improved lifestyle to his financial skills rather than anything concerning. The third red flag was the hardest to ignore. In August, I ran into one of Dad's former business clients who mentioned that he'd been surprised to learn that Caleb had sold the business. According to the client, the sale had happened months earlier, and the buyer had told him that Caleb was the sole owner who decided to liquidate the company. When I confronted Caleb about this, he seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't know about the sale. He explained that he'd found an excellent buyer who'd offered well above market value, and that the proceeds were safely invested in my account, earning better returns than the business had been generating. I thought I mentioned this in one of the monthly reports, he said, though I was certain he hadn't. The sale was too good to pass up, and the timing worked out perfectly. You're actually coming out way ahead financially. Caleb showed me documentation of the sale and the investment of the proceeds, and everything looked legitimate. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. Dad had built that business over 30 years, and I'd always assumed I'd continue running it as his legacy. The idea of it being sold without my direct input, even though I'd signed papers giving Caleb authority to manage it, left me feeling unsettled. That's when I started paying closer attention to the monthly reports Caleb had been sending me. I began comparing them to previous months and noticed some inconsistencies in account numbers and investment descriptions. Some of the assets that had been listed in earlier reports were no longer mentioned, and when I asked about them, Caleb would provide explanations about portfolio rebalancing and strategic reallocations. In September, I decided to verify some of the information independently. I called the investment firm that supposedly held one of my largest accounts and asked to speak with someone about my portfolio. After providing my identification information, the representative told me they had no record of any accounts in my name. When I confronted Caleb about this, he seemed annoyed that I was questioning his management of my affairs. He explained that the accounts were held in trust structures for tax and legal protection purposes, which meant they wouldn't show up under my name in normal database searches. This is exactly why I handle these things instead of you, he said with obvious frustration. You don't understand the complexities of asset protection and trust structures. If you keep calling around asking questions, you could actually compromise the legal protections we've set up. Caleb's dismissive attitude was a fourth red flag that I couldn't ignore. The brother who had been so patient and helpful during my divorce was now treating me like an annoying burden who didn't understand important financial matters. His explanations were becoming more condescending and less detailed, and he seemed irritated whenever I asked specific questions about my own inheritance. By October, I'd become suspicious enough to consult with an attorney who specialized in financial fraud and estate issues. I brought all of Caleb's monthly reports, copies of the power of attorney documents, and my own records of our conversations about protecting and eventually returning my inheritance. The attorney's assessment was devastating. Based on his review of the documentation, it appeared that Caleb had been using the power of attorney not to protect my assets but to permanently transfer them into his own name. The monthly reports I'd been receiving were essentially fiction, showing investments and accounts that either didn't exist or were actually owned by Caleb. Your brother has committed multiple felonies, the attorney told me bluntly. This isn't asset protection. This is theft on a massive scale. We need to act immediately to try to recover what's left of your inheritance. The attorney explained that Caleb had used sophisticated financial instruments and legal structures to make the theft appear legitimate, but that the pattern of transfers and the timing of various transactions clearly showed fraudulent intent. We would need to file both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits to have any chance of recovering my father's legacy. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the evidence of my brother's betrayal. Caleb hadn't just stolen my money. He'd stolen my trust in family, my faith in people's basic decency, and my father's life's work. But what he didn't know was that I'd been recording many of our conversations about the inheritance, and those recordings were about to become crucial evidence in court. The legal battle that followed would test everything I thought I knew about justice, family, and standing up for what's right. Filing charges against my own brother was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but my attorney made it clear that criminal prosecution was essential for recovering my inheritance. The district attorney's office was immediately interested in the case because of the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the substantial amount of money involved. Detective Reynolds, who specialized in white-collar crime, was assigned to investigate Caleb's financial activities. What she discovered was even worse than I'd initially suspected. Caleb hadn't just transferred my inheritance into his own accounts. He'd been systematically liquidating assets and converting them into untraceable forms of wealth. The business sale had been real, but Caleb had sold it for $150,000 more than he'd reported to me, keeping the extra money for himself. Dad's house had been sold 3 months earlier, with Caleb claiming in the paperwork that he was the sole heir. The investment accounts had been emptied gradually over several months, with the money transferred to offshore accounts that would be nearly impossible to trace. Detective Reynolds estimated that Caleb had stolen approximately $320,000 of my inheritance, using the power of attorney I'd signed to make all the transfers appear legal. She explained that this type of financial fraud was particularly difficult to prosecute because the perpetrator had legitimate legal documents authorizing their actions. Your brother is smart, she told me during one of our meetings. He used your emotional vulnerability and legal ignorance to create a nearly perfect theft. If you hadn't started asking questions and keeping records, he might have gotten away with it completely. The criminal case moved slowly through the system, but the civil lawsuit I'd filed to recover my assets moved even more slowly. Caleb had hired an expensive attorney who specialized in white-collar defense, and they were fighting every aspect of both cases with aggressive legal tactics. Caleb's defense strategy was to claim that everything he'd done was within the scope of the power of attorney I'd signed, and that he'd been acting in my best interests by protecting and growing my inheritance. His attorney argued that the financial arrangements were complex but legitimate, and that I was essentially suing my brother for being too successful at managing my money. During depositions, Caleb maintained the fiction that he'd been protecting my assets and that all the transfers were temporary measures designed to shield the inheritance from potential claims. He claimed that the offshore accounts were sophisticated trust structures recommended by financial advisors, and that I would have access to everything once the legal protections were properly established. But I had evidence that Caleb didn't know about. Throughout the entire process, I'd been recording our phone conversations using an app on my phone. In our state, only one party needs to consent to recording, which meant the recordings were legally admissible as evidence. The recordings told a very different story than Caleb's testimony. In multiple conversations, he'd explicitly promised to transfer everything back to my name once the divorce was finalized. He described the arrangement as temporary protection, not permanent asset management. Most damaging of all, there were recordings where he'd admitted that some of the transfers were designed to be difficult to reverse. Don't worry about the offshore stuff, I'd recorded him saying in July. That's just to make sure Jennifer's lawyers can never find it, even if they come back later with new claims. It's complicated to access, but that's the point. When my attorney played these recordings during Caleb's deposition, his confident demeanor cracked visibly. His expensive lawyer requested multiple breaks to confer with his client, and when they returned, Caleb's answers became much more evasive and defensive. The recordings also captured Caleb making statements that directly contradicted his sworn testimony. In court, he claimed that the business sale was a strategic decision made for my benefit. But in a recorded conversation from August, he'd admitted that he'd been looking for a buyer since taking control of the assets because managing the business was more trouble than it was worth. As the evidence mounted against him, Caleb's attitude toward me shifted from defensive to openly hostile. During a break in one court session, he cornered me in the hallway and accused me of being ungrateful for everything he'd done to help me during my divorce. "You would have lost everything to Jennifer if I hadn't stepped in," he said angrily. "Now you're trying to destroy my life because you don't understand basic financial management. This is how you repay someone who saved your ass." But the most revealing moment came during the final hearing, when Caleb's attorney was making closing arguments about the legitimacy of the asset transfers. As his lawyer explained how all of Caleb's actions had been designed to protect my inheritance, I could see Caleb smirking at the defense table. He actually laughed quietly when his attorney claimed that the offshore accounts were sophisticated wealth preservation tools, rather than attempts to hide stolen money. Caleb seemed to think he was going to win the case, that his expensive legal team and complex financial maneuvers had made his theft untouchable. The judge noticed Caleb's inappropriate behavior and asked him directly if he found something amusing about the proceedings. Caleb's attorney quickly intervened, claiming his client was just relieved that the truth was finally being presented clearly. But I could see that Caleb thought he'd beaten me. He'd used my trust and vulnerability to steal my father's life's work, and he believed he was going to get away with it because he was smarter and more sophisticated than his simple electrician brother. That's when the judge asked if I wanted to make a final statement before the court ruled on the civil claims. My attorney had prepared a standard victim impact statement, but I'd been planning something different. Something that would make it clear exactly what Caleb had stolen and why his theft was about more than just money. I stood up to address the court, and I could see Caleb still smirking at his table, confident that his legal team had protected him from any real consequences. He had no idea what I was about to say. I stood up slowly, looking directly at Judge Harrison, who had been presiding over this case for the past 6 months. I could feel Caleb's eyes on me from the defense table, probably expecting me to deliver some emotional plea about how his theft had affected me financially. But what I was about to reveal would change everything about this case. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I want to thank the court for the opportunity to speak, because there's something crucial that hasn't been discussed during these proceedings. Something that changes the entire nature of what my brother has stolen from me." I pulled out a folder I'd been keeping under the plaintiff's table and opened it carefully. When my father was dying of lung cancer 3 years ago, he made me promise something. He made me promise that I would use part of his inheritance to establish a scholarship fund at the community college where he'd taken night classes to become an electrician. Dad never finished high school, but he worked his way through that program while supporting a family, and he wanted to help other people who were trying to better their lives under difficult circumstances. The courtroom was completely silent. Caleb's smirk had disappeared, and I could see confusion on his face. He'd never heard about any scholarship fund. Dad had already set aside $50,000 specifically for this scholarship when he died, I continued. It wasn't just part of my inheritance, it was a sacred promise I made to a dying man. My father made me swear that I would honor his wish to help people who were struggling to get an education, just like he had struggled. I opened the folder and pulled out a handwritten letter, yellowed with age. This is a letter my father wrote to me 2 weeks before he passed away. He was too weak to speak much by then, but he managed to write this when the nurses weren't watching. Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "Would you like to read it to the court?" I nodded and began reading in a voice that remained steady despite the emotion building inside me. "Son, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, but I need you to know something important. The $50,000 in the savings account ending in 4472 isn't just money. It's hope for other people like me who never got a fair chance at education. I want you to establish the Patricia Memorial Scholarship at Riverside Community College, named after your mother, to help single parents and working adults finish their electrical training programs. This money represents every overtime hour I worked, every sacrifice your mother and I made, and every dream we had about helping others succeed. Promise me you'll make this happen, because it's the most important thing I'll ever ask of you." The silence in the courtroom was profound. I could see tears in the judge's eyes, and even some of the court staff were visibly moved. "Your Honor," I continued, "my brother didn't just steal my inheritance. He stole money that was meant to honor my mother's memory and fulfill my father's dying wish to help people get educated. He stole the dreams and opportunities of dozens of students who would have benefited from this scholarship over the years." I pulled out another document from the folder. I have the original scholarship application that Dad had partially filled out before he became too sick to continue. He'd already contacted the college about establishing the fund. He'd chosen the criteria for recipients, single parents, people over 30 trying to change careers, anyone who was working full-time while going to school. People like him. Caleb's face had gone pale. He was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. But there's more, Your Honor. After Dad died, I continued his research into establishing this scholarship. I discovered that Riverside Community College has a program that matches private scholarship donations dollar for dollar. That means Dad's $50,000 would have become $100,000 to help students. Over 20 years, with proper investment and matching funds, we're talking about potentially $500,000 in educational assistance. I turned to look directly at Caleb for the first time during my statement. My brother didn't just steal money from me. He stole educational opportunities from hundreds of people who needed help. He stole my ability to honor our parents' memory. He stole the chance for struggling students to achieve their dreams. And he did it all while pretending to protect my interests during the worst period of my life. The judge was taking notes furiously, clearly understanding the broader implications of what I was revealing. Your Honor, I'm not just asking for the return of my inheritance. I'm asking for justice for all the people who will never get the help my father intended to provide. Every day that money remains in my brother's accounts is another day that deserving students can't access the education assistance my parents worked their entire lives to fund. I closed the folder and looked back at Judge Harrison. My father died believing that I would keep his promise. He trusted me to honor his legacy of helping people who were struggling, just like he had struggled. My brother's theft didn't just take my money, it broke a sacred promise made to a dying man and betrayed the values my parents spent their lives teaching us. I sat down to complete silence. Caleb was staring at his hands, no longer smirking. His expensive attorney looked stunned, clearly realizing that everything had just changed. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Caleb, I want you to stand up and look at me. When Caleb reluctantly stood, the judge's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. In 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly demonstrates the difference between legal technicalities and moral obligations. Your brother has just revealed that your theft has implications far beyond personal financial loss. The judge's ruling would send shockwaves through both our family and the legal community. But more importantly, it would finally allow me to keep the promise I'd made to my dying father. Justice, it turned out, sometimes comes with the most unexpected revelations.